Thank you for joining us today virtually. We had hoped to be here at the museum in person. Unfortunately, that is not possible. Before we start today's program, I would like to give you a very brief introduction to the project. And I think the easiest way for me to do this is to read the very succinct 2 paragraphs in the new catalog that was just published. The Bacchus Conservation Project is a multidisciplinary, multi-phase endeavor that has involved curators, conservators, classicists, art historians, geoarchaeologists, engineers, 3D specialists, artists, and even a basketball player. The project centers on the composite statue of Bacchus, at whose core is a rare 2nd century torso. In the 1960s, experts advocated for the complete de-restoration of the statue to display this rare antiquity. After the statue was partially disassembled in the 1980s, Bacchus languished in storage until the beginning of the new millennium. The Bacchus Conservation Project was initiated by the North Carolina Museum of Art in 2013 to study the statue of Bacchus, understand how it was put together, trace its history, and complete the work begun decades before. The proposed de-restoration project made an about-face based on compelling engineering, scientific, conservation, and curatorial data. Instead of a de-restoration, the project became a re-restoration, aimed at bringing Bacchus back to its original appearance. So that's the quick description. I'm going to show you a few images so that you know which work of art we are actually talking about today in this nice program. This is what Bacchus looked like at the beginning. This is when it was proposed to disassemble this sculpture. This is what it looked like after the partial disassembly in the 1980s. And this is what we worked with. This is what we had at the very beginning of the project and the study of the statue. I just wanted to show you these 2 images for you to keep in mind for my next slide, but also for future presentations today, as some colleagues will likely mention these. So just to sum up really quickly, when it was proposed at the very beginning, the project was to take the statue completely apart to remove that torso. Now, that did not happen. And I should say we were going to take it apart, but also create a recreation of the statue of Bacchus based on those images. The project, that de-restoration could not happen. So we went for a re-restoration as mentioned, and we added a little extra. So on the torso and the statue, we put the head back on, we put the berries back on, and we added a little something extra that you will hear about today. So this is very quickly the statue of Bacchus and the briefest introduction to the project. We will now start our program, and the first speaker is going to be Mark Abbey, who is Associate Professor at the University of Georgia, Associate Professor of Art History. And it's thanks to his initial research and his report that the Bacchus Project was formed based on his ideas that he proposed and all the research he accomplished during this initial study. He will be talking to us today about the antiquities of Bacchus and the early provenance. Mark, the floor is yours.
Okay, great. Good morning, all. As visitors, let's see. How am I able to advance slides? Here we go, good, perfect. As visitors fortunate to have seen the exhibition will know, the Raleigh Bacchus is composed of 3 principal parts. An extensively restored ancient head of the god, a nude youthful torso from a different ancient statue, and extensive post-antique additions that made the resulting composite an immediately legible statue of the god of wine with an ivy and berry wreath, a taza wine cup, and a cluster.
I'm sorry, we can't see the slides. Can you try sharing your screen again?
Okay, let's see. Let's see here. Yeah? Can you see now?
Yes, we can see
Okay.
it.
Okay. All right. Sorry for that. So these are the three principal parts. As I was mentioning, this is an immediately legible statue of the god of wine with an ivy and berry wreath, a taza wine cup, and a cluster of grapes, while a tree trunk statue support added an outdoor bucolic setting for the god of joyous merriment, represented here in a canonical and iconographically rich Renaissance mode. Now let's see, how do, here we go. Okay, different way of forwarding slides now. The first known illustration of the Raleigh Bacchus appears in the first great public compendium, or graphic compendium of ancient sculpture by Comte de Clairac, where a statue of the same palm height, iconography, posture, and similar breaks is identified as being in the famous Palazzo al Temps in Rome, which housed the large collection of ancient sculpture assembled by Cardinal Marco Sitio al Temps in the 16th century and is now a branch of the National Roman Museum. The fascinating and detailed sculpture inventories of the Palazzo from the 17th and 18th century identify a statue of Bacchus of the same height and iconography on the large central staircase seen here. But statues of Bacchus were common in Rome in the 16th century and onward. And how should we be certain that the Raleigh Bacchus, or even confident, comes from the Palazzo al Temps and can even be displayed within this niched staircase? In my opinion, yes. Not just because of Clairac's description and the early collection inventories, but because in raking light, the Bacchus displays two previously unnoted incised asterisks, most likely early collection inventory marks. And I've been able to identify two identical asterisks on statues that were also from the same staircase. Now, regardless, the statue at left, I should mention, originates from the Palazzo Chioli, formed in the 1570s. So at the very least, even if the earliest history of the Bacchus remains unknown, the statue can now be confidently identified as having, as of 2020, a documented 400-year-old provenance history back to 1620, and to have heralded from one of the earliest large-scale private collections of ancient statuary in Renaissance Rome. What of the statue's two ancient parts? The head of Bacchus, extensively restored, presents a normative quality head of Dionysus with an ivy wreath and diadem in the manner, this is a common type in the Roman period, based on an earlier Hellenistic Greek type that was used extensively as sylvan villa decoration in central Italy. And it harkened back to an earlier languid mode of representing the god that you see at left. The ancient torso, in contrast, is a rare gem, and I'll linger here. Exquisitely carved, fully in the round, in a fine-grained marble with great anatomical detail and subtlety, we have a youth lunging forward in a dramatic posture, the right arm raised high and upward, arcing the back, drawing the swelling chest upward, while the left arm and leg are lowered and parallel. The torso was carved around the 2nd century AD, while stylistically the posture, musculature, and stylized pubic hair harken back to precedents in the early classical period of Greek art in the 5th century. 5 statues of this type, of this torso type, are known. All are from the Roman imperial period and undoubtedly originate from Rome or central Italy. This statue that you see here, the ancient fragments are mapped at right, was restored in the 16th century in the Farnese collection in Rome to be a warrior or gladiator, and is now in the Naples Archaeological Museum. A torso now in Florence, devoid of any evidence of historic restoration, is probably from the Roman art market at the turn of the last century. The two remaining examples of the statue type are more complete, and interestingly, both preserve ancient portrait heads. The ancient core of this statue, transformed in the 18th century into an image of Ganymede, and now in the Lady Lever Gallery near Liverpool, preserves the distinctive portrait head of Antinous, the prepubescent youth from the Greek East, plucked from obscurity by the Roman Emperor Hadrian, seen here at left, to be his favorite intimate companion and hunting partner. When Antinous drowned in the Nile in AD 130, he was subsequently widely honored and commemorated in hero-like form, both in the Greek East and in Rome and central Italy. Although the statue is often said to have been found in Hadrian's imperial villa at Tivoli, the antiquarian Giuseppe Ricci explicitly records that the statue was discovered in 1794 at the 5th milestone of the Via Latina in the suburban area outside of Rome that was rich in this period with the really top-end private luxury villas of the imperial elite. It was here, no doubt, that the statue was displayed. Last and most informative is a statue of a hunter, prominently displayed today in the Capitoline Museum's Braccio Nuovo. This is largely an ancient product, preserving all of its key narrative elements: the full-length figure, limbs, tree, hair, spear, and plinth, despite numerous 18th century restorations that are generally quite small. A bearded youth with a fashionable metropolitan hairstyle of the mid-3rd century AD is depicted in the dramatic action of culminating the victorious hunt, with his catch, a hare prominently displayed in his raised arm, paired with a lowered spear. This remarkable statue was found in near-complete fragments near the Porta Latina in 1747. It was almost certainly a private funerary statue that stood in the nearby large necropolis, probably in something akin to the utterly massive tombs in this area and elsewhere in Rome from this period, akin to this spectacular 30-foot marble temple-like tomb of a Roman aristocrat recently excavated on the Via Flaminia. Hunting had masculine, heroized connotations in Roman culture. It was the stuff of age-old Roman tradition and Greek myth. And it was age-defined. Youths hunted hares, the rich harvest of the hunt, according to the poet Oppian, while adult males hunted boars and bears. Now, hares are interesting. They had long-standing associations with vitality, as well as with fertility, and by extension, with Venus and love in Greek and Roman culture. A similar hare hunting narrative would be appropriate for the Antinous statue. This is akin to the similarly prepubescent hunting attendant that you have on the Hadrianic tondo, a detail at right, depicting the departure for an imperial hunt with Hadrian, now headless, at center. In sum, all 5 of our ancient sculptures originate from Rome and Central Italy and date to the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. The 2 preserving heads both have portraits and both appear to have had funerary commemorative associations for heroized predeceased youths. This was a statue type of surprisingly narrow geographical and chronological range that emerged in the 2nd century when hunting increasingly became a celebrated way for the elite of Rome and Central Italy to display their virtues. It was the stuff of poetry, contemporary sport manuals, and a new class of portrait statues known as venatorio habito, that is, statues in the guise of a hunter. Through hunting, Roman males displayed virtus, an aggressive, assertive, focused manliness best displayed in the bold vitality of victory. Intimately related to our small group of exquisite statues of hunters are the more widespread contemporary hunt sarcophagi, where the hunt is similarly telescoped into a single defining heroic moment. We, of course, don't know who was commemorated as the heroized youthful hunter in the high-quality torso of the Raleigh Bacchus. The lavish statue type was undoubtedly restricted to the highest of the high elites and was no doubt always exceptional and of limited output, requiring an unusually massive, if not conspicuously wasteful, block of marble, masterfully and delicately carved by sculptors of exceptional skill. Even in isolation, the well-preserved torso of the Raleigh Bacchus is suggestive of this larger, dramatic, and once emotionally moving whole. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this wonderful presentation. Our next speaker will be Lyle Humphrey, who is Associate Curator of European Arts and Collection History at the North Carolina Museum of Art. Lyle joined the project just a few years ago as she was doing some research at the Morgan Library on something else, and suddenly I got a flurry of emails and texts saying I found a box about Bacchus, and that is how she joined the project. She will tell us today about the US provenance of Bacchus, but also the history of acquisition at the NCMA. Lyle.
Hi, thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay, are we good?
Can you put it in slide mode, please?
Oh, yes, okay. Hi. Photographs taken by North Carolina newspaper reporters throughout the museum's inaugural year, 1956, testify to Bacchus's prominent placement within the original downtown Raleigh location. Stationed in the entrance hall opposite the front door and flanking the enfilade of galleries designated for British paintings, Bacchus greeted visitors to the building on East Morgan Street from opening day until the collection was relocated to the present site on Blue Ridge Road, beginning in early 1982. The statue was one of approximately 300 works of art installed in the newly established State Art Museum, according to a plan by 3 individuals: Wilhelm R. Valentiner, the museum's first director; Robert L. Humber, chairman of the executive committee of the North Carolina State Art Society, the NCMA's forerunner organization, and also chairman of the State Art Commission. This was a 5-member committee charged with acquiring art on behalf of the planned museum using $1 million that had been appropriated by the 1947 state legislature. And Carl Hamilton, the New York art dealer who had been a member in the State Art Commission since 1951. Hamilton is in the background of this photograph, and this is Humber in the foreground. Surprisingly though, Bacchus entered the museum's collections unheralded in late 1955 and was not accessioned until February 1958. Today, I will retrace the sculpture's steps from Rome in the spring of 1911 to Raleigh in the spring of 1956 to demonstrate when, why, and how the sculpture was acquired by the NCMA, as well as where it had resided in America prior to its arrival in North Carolina. The earliest known reference to Bacchus in Raleigh appears in a letter of February 15, 1956, from Valentiner to the New York art dealer Abra Silverman concerning a group of 7 objects that had been sent on approval to the North Carolina State Art Society in late December 1955. Would you be so kind as to send us the price list of the objects we have here on approval from you, and which Mr. Hamilton selected? 2 silver candlesticks, a silver chandelier, bust of a prophet, alabaster, Flemish, late 16th century, marble Pietà, Low Rhenish, late 15th century, marble Tondo, Federigo of Urbino, which we had in Detroit on exhibit, a large statue of Bacchus, which I understand came from the Pierpont Morgan collection. He then clarified that the values are needed for insurance purposes only, as all the funds given by the state have been used up. Responding to Valentiner's request, Silverman provided a price list on February 20th, in which Bacchus was listed as the most expensive work at $3,500. Evidence suggests that Valentiner and the commission had already decided to purchase Bacchus before it was sent to Raleigh, because Silverman's preferred objects conservator, Joseph Turnbach, a noted art restorer who settled in Queens after escaping from Nazi persecution in 1938, did some minor restoration work on it on behalf of Hamilton and the NCMA while it was still in New York. In any case, the sculpture was installed in the Morgan Street entrance hall by the time the museum opened. And at some point, Robert Humber persuaded his brother, John D. Humber, a surgeon who had been living in San Francisco since 1921, to pay for it. It was not until February 1958 that the sculpture was formally accessioned as a loan of Humber and his wife. Subsequently, it was converted into a gift apportioned in fractional installments. The director was engaged throughout the spring in various activities, including opening the major Kirchner retrospective he had organized for the NCMA, and vetting and negotiating the substance of a gift from the Samuel H. Kress Foundation, a collection of European paintings, quote, of a value of at least $1 million, end quote, that had been promised to the NCMA founders in January 1951. On May 1st, Valentiner embarked on his annual sojourn in Europe. While in Munich, meeting publishers, he became seriously ill. America from Genoa, and 5 days after arriving in New York, following a difficult voyage, Valentiner resigned his post as NCMA director, quote, to devote his full time to writing, end quote. He survived only 1 week of his final retirement. In 1961, Valentiner's successor, Eustace Beer, looked into the suggestion of Bacchus provenance in the Pierpont Morgan collection. He wrote to Frederick Adams, the Morgan Library's second director after Belle Costa Green, who confirmed that the sculpture had indeed once belonged to Pierpont Morgan and had ended up in one of the Joseph Brummer estate sales of 1949, part 3, where the Bacchus was cataloged as from the collection of Pierpont Morgan, New York, and previously with the dealer Ercole Canessa. Note, this reply is addressed not to Beer, but to the person who donated the sculpture to the NCMA, John D. Humber, who was apparently seeking an appraisal. This prompted a letter to Ernest Brummer, Joseph's youngest brother and gallery partner, who affirmed that the marble Bacchus from the Morgan collection had sold at the Brummer estate sale, quote, for the ridiculously low price of $1,500. Morgan bought it, according to my information, from Ercole Canessa for $50,000. Such large size Roman marble statues are not only rare today, but practically impossible to get. And in my opinion, the real value of this statue today is more than the original price paid by J.P. Morgan more than a century ago to Knessa, who was at the time one of the best and most reputable art dealers, end quote. An annotated copy of the relevant sale catalog on view in Caroline's exhibition now confirms most of this information and lists Silberman as the buyer. Bacchus also appears in 2 different inventory records surviving from the Brummer Gallery, each illustrated with the same thumbnail photograph, showing his intact right arm extended overhead, holding a bunch of grapes, and with genitals covered with a fig leaf. The Brummer inventory card records Joseph Brummer's acquisition of the sculpture from the Pierpont Morgan Library on May 3rd, 1945 for $4,000, and Morgan's purchase of the same from for 30,000 pounds. Pierpont Morgan's imperial scale collecting and art philanthropy in Europe and America is well documented. An interest in travel to exotic lands, antiquities, sacred treasury objects, and historical artifacts led him around 1904 to the naval dealers Cesare and Ercole Knessa, from whom he would acquire scores of antiquities and medieval objects up until his death in 1913, including most Cyprus treasure, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the Hellenistic bronze Eros holding a torch that Knessa had excavated from the ruins of the Villa Maxima near Bosco Reale. It was Ercole who sold Morgan the Bacchus in April 1911, along with 4 other antiquities for 36,000 pounds. This is roughly equivalent to 2,460,000 pounds using the retail price index. According to the invoice, Bacchus and 2 other statues, a gladiator and a Mercury, were, quote, discovered during the Renaissance in the excavations made by Cardinal Altemps in Nero's villa at Antium, the ancient city off the coast of Lazio, about 33 miles south of Rome, where several famous sculptures such as the Apollo Belvedere have been discovered and were discovered during the Renaissance among the villas. Nero was born here, but the site said to have been his residence was actually an imperial villa inhabited continuously from Augustus to Septimus Severus. A later annotation in pencil by Morgan's librarian, Belle de Costa Green, shows that all 5 objects were located in Mr. Morgan's library as of December 1911. The library, of course, refers to the building on East 36th Street, commissioned in 1900 from Charles Fullen McKim to house Morgan's prodigious book and manuscripts collection, and completed in 1906. At Morgan's death in 1913, his son and heir, Jack Morgan, sold about half his father's art collection in order to maintain liquidity of the estate. He donated the remainder of the collection in 1916 and 1917, making large gifts to both the Metropolitan Museum of Art and Wadsworth Atheneum in Hartford. Although Jack did not share his father's love of art, he retained a number of works and allowed them to remain in situ in the library even after it was opened to the public in 1924. An inventory of the Morgan Library drawn up in January 1927 lists Bacchus as one of 3 sculptures displayed in the entrance hall, or central rotunda. The other 2, Barbette's bronze angel from the Chateau du Lude, one of Pierpont's favorite possessions, acquired in 1906 from the Parisian decorator Georges Hunchel, and a 16th century bronze bust of Alfonso II de Avalos, purchased from Jacques Seligman in 1905, then attributed to Leone and now to Annibale Fontana. Photographs taken between 1923 and 1928 show Bacchus standing in the southwest corner of the rotunda, directly opposite Angel. In the south. The trio remained intact until Jack's death in 1943, at which point the library's Board of Trustees began selling some of its holdings, starting with Barbet's Angel, which was acquired by the Frick collection from Knodler in 1943. 2 years later, Joseph Brummer paid the library $4,000 for Bacchus and $250 for a Roman sarcophagus with biographical reliefs that had stood in the Morgan Library garden. The bust of Alfonso II was retained by the Morgan Library and is now displayed in Mr. Morgan's study. Therefore, the Morgan Library, the Morgan Rotunda, recently restored to its former glory, is lacking sculptures other than the beautiful marble revetments designed by Charles Fullen McKem. Joseph Brummer resold the sarcophagus in 1947 for 24 times the purchase price to none other than Wilhelm Valentiner, then director consultant at the Los Angeles County Museum. Valentiner's willingness to pay so large a sum likely reflects both a recognition of the object's intrinsic value and an appreciation for its Morgan provenance. Morgan, as president of the Metropolitan Museum of Art from 1904 to 1913, had played a pivotal role in Valentiner's life, giving him his first U.S. job as curator of the newly created Department of Decorative Arts at the museum. Reflecting on Morgan's salient qualities of an art collector years later, Valentiner described him as the greatest collector I have known, and alluded to the friendship that developed between the two of them, especially when Morgan was nearing the end of his life. He died in 1913. Given this connection between Valentiner and Pierpont Morgan, reinforced by Valentiner's purchase of the sarcophagus for LACMA in 1947, it is tempting to view the addition of Bacchus to the NCMA's collections in 1956 as motivated partly by the director's recollection of the statue when it had stood in the rotunda of the library, where he visited his patron regularly. He certainly would have been aware of its arrival in New York in 1911, as it was one of the first sculptures acquired by Morgan in Europe that was shipped to New York prior to 1912. Sentimental associations aside, Bacchus fit into Valentiner's expressed vision of building a museum of sculpture representing various cultures from antiquity through the present to complement the museum of painting they had already created. He wrote, "Modern civilization is so far-reaching in its relations to other continents that art education cannot limit itself to painting created since the Renaissance, as the museum had done, but has to embrace the history of the world from its beginnings in art to the most modern tendencies." He goes on, "Such an accomplishment would constitute another surprise to the art world, creating an impression which was made possible by the appropriation by the North Carolina General Assembly of $1 million, and would speak for the alertness of the people of North Carolina in regards to art and culture." Thank you.
Thank you, Lyle, for guiding us through the history of the acquisition of Bacchus. Our next speaker is Fernando Lofredo. I have to say he was extremely difficult to find. He has a very obscure, I guess in a way, specialty. He is specialized in composite sculpture, and that is why we really, really needed him. He is assistant professor of early modern Mediterranean and colonial art at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. Fernando?
Thank you so much, Caroline, and in particular, thank you, and I want to thank you and Maria for your patience. I'm currently in Madrid, and the situation, as you all know, was pretty bad. So also scheduling this was not very easy. Let's say that. Today, since I only have 10 minutes, I would like to make three main points about the history of restoration in early modern Rome, but also modern Rome in the case of Bacchus. So the first point is really putting Bacchus in the context of the history of restoration in Rome. And I think that there is no better way than a passage written by Joseph Scaliger, who is one of the most renowned humanists of European humanists of the 16th century. And I would like to encourage you to look at Bacchus while I read this passage for you. I quote, "We have set off what is Festus from what is ours." Just a note, here Scaliger is talking about his philological process. So he's talking about his the addition of the Verborum Significatione by Festus and the way in which he was integrating the text, the ancient text. So I start again. "We have set off what is Festus from what is ours, so that we may convince the reader that we neither believe nor wish to persuade others that what does not belong to Festus belongs to him. I have imitated the men who love and study old images and statues. They sometimes have an elegantly carved marble statue, which perhaps because of its age is mutilated and lacks a section, as often happens. They seek out skilled craftsmen to fill the missing space with their own work. All who see the statue know both what portion of the old craftsmanship has been lost and what has been added by the new. Yet, the addition is often so important that without it, the remaining portion and symmetry of the whole statue would be impossible to detect. This is what we have done in this passage. For without the limbs we have added, it would be very difficult to tell what the trunk was. Now, so far as we can tell, we have done something most useful to scholars. For by our diligence, we have restored this building that was almost level to ground from its foundations and set it in good repair." End of quote. This is what Scaliger actually said about not only the philological process of editing a text, but also the philological process of restoration in early modern Rome. And it's actually interesting because we can say that it's not 100% true, since these cases were very exceptional in Rome. Many times restorations were made just because of aesthetics, needs. So I would like now to make my second point, and this is something that is interesting for our discourse because it's an example of very accurate, almost, a very accurate restoration that is almost a forgery. I'm showing you a statue of Abundancia with a face of Faustina the Younger as Ceres in the Musei Capitolini in Rome. And it's an ancient colossal statue that was restored in 1564 by a very talented sculptor at that time. One of those talented sculptors Scaliger was mentioning in his passage. I'm showing you, there was a very long debate about the statue and the head of the statue, as you can see here. I recently published an article about this, documenting the restoration that Tommaso della Porta made. And here you can see, for example, a comparison between a brand new work by Tommaso della Porta, an allegory of faith on the left, and his intervention on the statue of Abbondantia in the Musei Capitolini. It's actually very interesting to us because for a couple of centuries there was a very long debate about the head of the Abbondantia, and so many scholars thought that the head was ancient, but does not belong to the statue. Very recently, in the very recent catalog of the Musei Capitolini in Rome, a very well-known archaeologist said the same thing in his entry, saying that the head of Faustina the Younger does not belong to the statue, but is actually an ancient piece. It's an ancient head. As I told you, I was able to document the intervention of Tommaso della Porta on this specific sculpture, but it's very interesting to notice the fact that a contemporary archaeologist actually made this mistake, because Tommaso was a very, very talented forger at his time. And this is told by Vasari in his Lives that I'm quoting here. Vasari talks very briefly about Tommaso, saying, Milan has also had another sculptor that is here, called Tommaso della Porta, who worked marble excellently well, and in particular made counterfeited antique heads in marble, which have been sold as antiques. And masks he made so well that in them no one has equaled him, of which I have one in marble by his hand, placed on my chimney piece of my house at Arezzo, which everyone takes for an antique. Not one of our imitators of antiques was superior to this Tommaso, of whom it has seemed to me right that record should be made, in his Lives, of course, and the rather as he has passed to a better life, living name and fame for his ability. End of quote. So this is what Giorgio Vasari said in 1568 about Tommaso, and it's actually very interesting the fact that a catalog published in 2015 still thinks that this head is an antique, while is a work by Tommaso della Porta, as is now documented. So Vasari was right, and Tommaso was very talented in forging ancient sculpture. And in particular, I would like to show you a detail. If you can, in the image on like bottom right, you can see the profile of the head of Abbondantia, and between the clocks there are like little bridges made out of marble. These are called visible bridges in the archaeological language, in the archaeological vocabulary, and this is a peculiarity of the age of Faustina the Younger. So Tommaso della Porta not only was imitating the style of ancient sculpture, but also the technique. He was so accurate that he was making restorations that were very, very close to forgery. And here I would like to make my last point about the Bacchus. When I was called by Caroline and Corey, they told me about a Bacchus restored in early modern Rome. So I was very excited. And when I got to North Carolina Museum of Art, I realized that this statue was actually restored much later than that, as you can see, for example, in this detail. Of course, the statue is recorded in Clarac, as Mark Abbey said, and this is a publication that was printed in 1847, but Clarac was in Rome in around 1808. So we have to think that the restoration was, the current restoration was made before 1808, and this is actually this makes sense because if we look at details, we can see that those details are very gentle, are very refined, and they're like neoclassical details and not Renaissance or late Renaissance or early Baroque details. So now we have to there are new things, new research to do. For example, the question about the inventory, the presence of the Bacchus in the inventory 1620 in the Palazzo Altemps in Rome. But it's possible that Bacchus was actually in Palazzo Altemps in 1620 as a Bacchus, and it was restored in the 16th century and then restored again at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century. And actually we now keep the very last restoration, so the neoclassical restoration. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fernando. As we are running a little bit late, we will move on straight to our next speaker. We are not taking a break, and now we're moving to the sciences. Our next speaker is Scott Pike, who conducted the marble analysis of the statue of Bacchus. Scott comes to us from Willamette University, where he is professor of environmental science and archaeology. Scott, your turn.
Now I'm unmuted. Good morning, everyone. It's morning here in Oregon. Good afternoon in North Carolina, and good evening in Spain. Thank you, Caroline, for this opportunity to discuss a little bit about the work I did on the Bacchus. It was a wonderful project, and I really enjoyed the interdisciplinary approach that this restoration has taken. As we've already seen in this work from our previous speakers, particularly Mark Abbey and Fernando, the Bacchus statue, as presented to the museum when it was first purchased, looks like a single piece of marble, one piece of marble. But through various studies and analysis, or using different lighting sources like ultraviolet, we can start to see that the marble itself is broken up into fragments, different leg pieces, different heads, and in a side view, we can also see patches here on the left, down by the base, and when you look even more closely at the statue, you see metal poles and rods that were used to keep the statue together and in one, to make it one whole. The question that one of my specialties is in marble analysis, and the question that was being asked is, if this is all different marble pieces, is the sculpture itself from one single piece of marble, or maybe one marble type? Or is it possible that the marbles are coming from different sources from the Aegean or Eastern Mediterranean world? So we do know that in antiquity, marble was coming from different sources, both in Greece and Italy, and some Turkish sources. So this map just highlights the major known quarries from the Mediterranean. We had Carrara in Italy, but also Pentelicon and Hymettus in Attica, Greece, the Cycladic Islands, famous for its Parian marble, and in the Archaic period, Naxos. A newly found and discovered quarry in Göktepe, which appears to be quite large and extensively used in the Roman period, Ephesus, Aphion, Proconnesus, and Thassos. These were the major marble producing regions, and the possibility that these different sources could have provided marble for the Bacchus, whether the original pieces or later restoration pieces, was of interest, especially for the restoration process. So during the restoration, Corey and her team, as they were taking apart the statue, they were able to collect small samples, which are identified by these number spots. 15 samples in all from various large fragments of the sculpture, as well as some of the smaller plugs that were placed in various holes during the restoration, previous restoration processes. Now, why did we want these small samples? Okay, here comes some science. This is where a geologist gets involved. Hopefully, I'll try to get through this quickly, but marble is made out of a mineral called calcite. And calcite is a carbonate. It's made of carbon and oxygen. And what's interesting about carbon and oxygen is that they have isotopes. Isotopes are essentially different weights of those elements at the atomic scale. And I have up here a slide of just the nucleus of carbon. Most carbon is carbon-12. Almost 99% of all carbon is carbon-12. And carbon-12 essentially has 6 protons and 6 neutrons in its nucleus. Now, the isotopes of carbon-12 include carbon-13 and carbon-14. Carbon-13 at just about 1%, 6 protons, but 7 neutrons. It's a little heavier, a little more massive. Whereas carbon-14, which is very, very little carbon, of all the carbon out there, it's less than 0.1%, 6 protons and 8 neutrons. And then I crossed this out because carbon-14 is radioactive. It decays with time. And after about 70,000 years, if you have a sample, there's no more carbon-14 in it. So I'm going to ignore carbon-14. So I crossed it out. So what we do as a geochemist is we can look at the amount of carbon, carbon-12 and carbon-13 in a sample. And we can weigh that. Now, throughout geologic history, that ratio of carbon-12 and carbon-13 has changed. We also know that during a rock's formation, the rock as it forms will take different ratios. Sometimes there'll be more carbon-12 in it, sometimes there'll be less. And what we have done then is we take marble from throughout these quarries. We go and we sample the rocks, many rocks actually, and we measure the carbon isotopes and we measure the oxygen isotopes. Oxygen behaves the same way. There are 3 stable isotopes. And if you're of a quantitative type of person, we take those ratios and we throw them in this calculation. I don't want to go into it, but essentially what we are doing is measuring the ratio of the 2 most common stable isotopes, carbon-13 and carbon-12, oxygen-16 and oxygen-18. Okay, and again, they are coming from the mineral calcite. So this is the calcium carbonate. So this is the mineral that makes up marble. And it's the carbon and it's the oxygen that we're interested in, and we're measuring the isotopes. So we've gone around the Eastern Mediterranean, we've collected marble samples from all the quarries, and we've created these plots. And there's a lot of information in this plot. What these large hand-drawn circles or ellipses is essentially the Aegean marble database. These are the different quarries represented by stable isotopes. So Pe, for instance, is pentellic. So all this field here is representing marble from the pentellic quarries. Pa1 is the porous quarries. Okay, So PR, prokinesis. So we can see the different marble sources represented on this bivariate or scatter plot diagram. Ideally, each of these circles would have been separated. Each of these zones would have been unique so that the stable isotopes alone could identify different marble sources. Unfortunately, there is some overlap. The blue diamonds are representing the 15 samples that were collected off of the Bacchus monument. So with those small samples that were collected, I ran the stable isotopes of carbon and oxygen and took those values and plotted them on the scatter plot diagram. And as you can see, we are working with marbles from different sources. Now, one of the difficulties with, I should say complexities of this technique is the stable isotopes alone cannot definitively give us the quarry location. We have to use other data as well. So while I was in North Carolina, I looked at some of the properties of the marble. Mostly I was interested in the texture, that is the grain size. Was it coarse grained or fine grained? I looked at the foliation. That means, did the grains have preferred orientations or not? Thin sections were made of the marble as well, and the analysis of the thin sections also could help me deduce the texture, grain size, foliation. And with all this data, what we can do then is go back to the map of the Aegean quarries, and we can start to locate where different fragments of the Bacchus came from, at least the Bacchus restoration. So going from left to right, we can see the mullet, the hair mullet, came from Carrara. We can see that the right leg and left arm are from Mount Pentelicon, just outside of Athens. The base and the tree trunk had a bluish hue, a bluish color. They come from Hymettus, also outside of Athens. The left leg from Paros. The ephesus from Aphion, or perhaps, the torso from Aphion, or perhaps Ephesus. And then the head from Thasos. So we can see that this marble, not only can we visually identify that it's made up of fragments, we can also identify that there are different marbles being used as a source. If we look at the history of the quarry use of each of these marble types, we can see that they were all opened in antiquity. What is most interesting and what the red circle is indicating is that at Mount Pentelicon and Hymettus, the two Attic sources, those were quarries that were used in the classical period. All the others are Roman and later uses. So in summary then, perhaps the oldest material used for the sculpture comes from Attica, could be Pentelic, if we consider sort of as the base of the statue from which other parts were added on. And then later restorations and modifications to the statues, we've seen that there were perhaps two major periods of restoration. They employed marbles that were from different sources available to them, perhaps through stockyards or whatever the marble economy was at that time. Thank you, and that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Scott, for taking us around the Mediterranean to show how, very well traveled, let's say, Bacchus's fragments his marble were. We're going to continue with the sciences. Our next speaker is Jennifer Mass, who is a conservation scientist with scientific analysis of fine art. And Jennifer actually studied the conservation materials, things that hold Bacchus together. And she will be talking to us about that. Jen, the floor is yours.
Video and audio here and my presentation. Okay, I'm delighted to have the opportunity to talk this morning about the restoration history of the Raleigh Bacchus. I love this process of reverse engineering antiquities, trying to figure out what happened to them over their lifetimes and how it happened. So thank you for joining me today to take a look at this research. And I also wanted to say that this type of archaeological science is very much a collaborative endeavor. And so I want to thank all of my colleagues who participated in this research with me. Okay, so as we've seen previously, the Raleigh Bacchus has gone through tremendous change in his lifetime, and even a fairly low-tech method, just this long-wave ultraviolet image that we see here, gives you a sense, based on the different fluorescent colors, of all of the different materials that are currently being used in order to be able to present Bacchus in his current form. And so we see all of these different colors of fluorescences that intimate that we have different restoration materials. And some of the materials that we wanted to understand are Bacchus's fills, where they're going to make the joins nice and clean, adhesives that have been used, the history even of the cleaning residues, and the coatings that have been applied to Bacchus, and even the metallurgy of the pins and the hardware that have gone into supporting Bacchus. And to understand these required a series of elemental, molecular, and microscopic techniques. Here's a look at the various materials analysis methodologies that we used. As I was putting this slide together, I noticed there was a certain aesthetic that instrument manufacturers seem to be going for when they design these instruments. Blue seems to be prominent. And so we have the three molecular analysis techniques first: infrared and Raman spectroscopy, which are types of molecular fingerprinting techniques, and mass spectrometry, as well as the scanning electron microscope that we use predominantly for elemental analysis, and then cross-section microscopy to get a sense of the coatings. And I've highlighted infrared spectroscopy here because that turned out to be the most fruitful method for understanding the restoration history of Bacchus. Of particular interest to us from a conservation perspective was some of the reddish-brown staining that you can see here on the proper right calf, and also the yellow-brown staining that you see in the pectoral area of Bacchus's torso. We wanted to understand what these materials were to see if the staining could be knocked back a little bit so that it was a little bit less distracting. Staining on marble antiquities is unfortunately a pretty big problem. As we've heard earlier, marble is made up of grains of a single mineral, calcium carbonate, and unfortunately it's a relatively porous stone and it has a large grain size. These make it quite susceptible to staining. In fact, if you have a broken piece of marble like I'm showing here, you can see how large the crystal grains are. They're actually visible to the naked eye. And this is 1 to 10 millimeter grain size that you can see in the image of the right is particularly appropriate for the Mediterranean marbles that were used in antiquity. And in a way, this is wonderful, this large grain size, because that gives marble the magnificent translucency that made it so appealing to the sculptors of antiquity, but it's created some conservation problems for us down the road. Marble is unfortunately slightly water soluble, and when it's exposed to acidic groundwater or acidic cleaning solutions, then the grain boundaries of the calcium carbonate crystals start to get etched away, and it becomes even more susceptible to staining. And it also develops a weathered surface layer. And you might think 0.1 millimeter, that's tiny, but in fact, that's going to be extremely visible. Very, very thin layers can be can enact dramatic changes to the surface of an object. What's chemically happening on the surface of the marble when it gets weathered is that it's being transformed from calcium carbonate into a hydrated form of calcium sulfate that's known as gypsum, or to another mineral called calcium oxalate. Both of these minerals are larger than calcium carbonate, and so the surface actually expands and becomes even more porous. And so what's sometimes called the patina on an ancient marble, or the alteration or weathering layer, is in fact quite porous. What we're looking at the bottom right is the layer of gypsum crystals that forms on the surface of ancient marble. And you can imagine if an organic coating is applied to an ancient marble, as they always are, how that coating would get stuck in those porous crystals and be nearly impossible to fully remove. So what exactly are these stains made of on marble antiquities? Well, often they're made from the residue of coatings that have been applied to the marbles over the millennia. This includes natural waxes, plant resins, synthetic resins, or even tallow coatings. And basically the oxidation of these coatings over the centuries forms chromophores. The coatings turn either yellow or brown over time. This is something that we're very familiar with in the conservation of paintings of yellowed varnishes that need to be removed and replaced. And something very similar happens on marble sculpture. This oxidation is turning these same type of hydrocarbon materials yellow over time. This is complicated in marble by the presence of mineral inclusions such as pyrites, iron sulfides, that as they oxidize are going to cause a reddish brown color to form as well. So I want to focus first on the stain on the proper right pectoral. And so what we're looking at here is infrared spectroscopy data, where the red spectrum is from Bacchus, and then the other spectra are comparisons to the Bacchus data from the basically tens of thousands of spectra that are of artist materials in our database. And what I'm pointing at here with the red arrow is that we can see on the pectoral area not only the expected calcium carbonate, but also that a calcium oxalate film has developed there. So of course, when we go from the carbonate to the oxalate, the surface is going to expand, become even more porous, and the entrainment of these degraded organic films is going to become even more problematic, which gives us evidence of what our stain is made out of. And we saw the exact same thing in the other stained area on the proper right calf. And in the red spectrum, the box spectrum from the calf that we compare to our reference spectrum in green, we see a wonderful match for gypsum. And so again, we have an alteration layer here that's entrained organic surface coatings. So to date, this is our hypothesis. But then we wanted to see if we really think that these stains are due to organic surface coatings, can we find organic surface coatings elsewhere on the sculpture? And in fact, we could, and we would expect that. If we look at the writing of, for example, Pliny or Plutarch or Vitruvius, they all talk about the process of gnosis, the coating of marble with punic wax, which would have been a mixture of purified beeswax and plant resin. And in fact, what we find on the surface of Bacchus is remnants of dihydroabiatic acid, and this is the main component of oxidized pine resin. And this oxidized pine resin is a residue not only from antiquity, but of subsequent plant resin coatings that were put on Bacchus as well. And from our microscopy work, we could find at least evidence of 3 campaigns of coatings that had been applied to Bacchus over the centuries. So what type of fills would we expect in order to make these joins nice and smooth? Well, it turns out that the Renaissance literature, if we look at the writings, for example, of Borghini or Boselli or Cellini, give us lots of information about what these fills should be made of. They talk about a joining stucco that's prepared from pine resin, yellow wax, and marble powder. And that's just exactly what we see in the elements of Bacchus's crown, that the leaves and the berries are joined to Bacchus's head with a mixture of pine resin, marble dust, and beeswax. But those weren't the only fills that we identified on Bacchus. We were also able to see gypsum fills or plaster-based fills, and those were predominantly on Bacchus's body in the area, for example, of the leg joints here, and then silica-based films in the feet or fills in the feet and arm. These gypsum-based restoration plasters, and I'm showing the data for that here, are really a 17th century technology. So that gives us an idea of the date after which these fills were applied. And then what we originally thought was a patina that we saw on Bacchus's leaves and berries, in fact, turned out to be the residue of his historic surface cleaning. It used to be that a clay poultice was applied to marble antiquities in order to really draw the staining out from the stone. This was done in the 19th century and the early 20th century, and these adipolgite clays are really challenging to remove, especially when you've got lots of recessed areas like you do in the area of the hair and the crown. So in conclusion, we were able to identify 3 different restoration campaigns. The Renaissance technology we found in the crown, we found a 17th century technology in the legs and the torso, and then the silica fills, that's really a 20th century technology in the arms and the feet. So I'd like to give a tremendous hand to Caroline and Corey, especially from the North Carolina Museum of Art. I was so delighted to be involved in this fascinating project, and also to my colleagues at Scientific Analysis of Fine Art, Adam and Satoko and Becca, and then my colleagues in the Art Conservation Department at SUNY College at Buffalo, Aaron and Rebecca Ploger. And I'd also like to thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jen. We will take a few minutes to answer questions. So we'll bring our panel, all the speakers, Mark, Lyle, Fernando, Scott, Jennifer. If we have any questions, Maria will be fielding those questions to us.
Sorry, we only received one question, and it was, I guess this is directed to you, Caroline. Someone wants to know how they can purchase a Bacchus catalog.
When we find out, we will share that information with you. We will send it to all the participants in today's symposium.
All right, we're getting some comments that in the chat, people saying that it's a fascinating session. Wonderful, fascinating. And Diane Beckman says she learned so much that she doesn't have any questions yet, so that's good.
Could I ask if we can ask questions of our colleagues? Yeah.
Of course.
Okay. I have a couple questions, but I'll start with just one. And that's for Fernando. Thank you so much for your really stimulating and thought-provoking presentation. I wonder what your thoughts are about this later restoration campaign or alteration. And I wonder what your thoughts are in looking at the statue about its extent. Yeah. I mean, how extensive is this, and do you think it's aesthetically driven, or is this, is this damage driven? Yeah, I mean, you showed the hand and that projecting hand, and I was like, are we talking about local things, or are we talking about a broader reformation of the statue? And linked with that, perhaps, like, you raised this really thought-provoking questions about authenticity, yeah, and how that's a period eye effect, yeah. So I wondered if you might sort of say something about that. Is this something that's gone from being a good antique in the 16th, 17th century, and then by the 18th century has become, for lack of a better way of putting it, sort of a compromised object?
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for those two very, it's very complicated questions. I've been working on those specific questions in the last probably 8 years. And it depends on so many factors. The most important factor is actually where the statue was kept, and we are not 100% sure. So, and this might be, I mean, aesthetics might be the reason why it was restored, probably at least twice. But it's not the, I mean, it's not the only reason. We know cases from major antiquarian collections in Rome, but these are very exceptional cases. The Farnese, for example, or the Este in Ferrara and then in Mantua, or the Medici in Florence. We know that in those cases they were commissioning restoration campaigns, I mean, several restoration campaigns throughout at least 3 centuries. So if we're not 100% sure about the provenance, I mean, the original provenance of Bacchus, is very difficult to find out why it was restored at least twice. I started my analysis from stylistic considerations. And as I told you, when I thought it was an early modern restoration. I thought it was a late 16th century restoration, but this cannot be the case because of the stylistic factor of those restorations. But we also have to be aware that the restoration techniques were pretty much the same ones from the 16th century until the first half of the 19th century. So the technique and the way in which marbles were restored was more or less the same one, and sculptors were working with the same tools. So it's also very difficult to find out if it's a 16th century restoration or, for example, late 17th century restoration, because the technique is pretty much the same. So, and the question of forgery is probably the most interesting one. And there, I think that is very, very hard to draw like a red line. Sometimes they were playing with forgeries. Sometimes they were pretending they had like ancient sculptures, but it was evident that was like restored sculpture. But sometimes they were forgeries, and they were sold as antiques, and we do have documents about that. And sometimes we also have people suing or patrons suing sculptors or specialists because of that. So I think that's the most interesting part of the thing. But unfortunately, it cannot be black on or white. There is a lot of gray between those two.
Thanks so much.
I'd like to share a few more comments. Mary Lyman says it's fascinating to range from very local to very global in the information that was presented. And Andrew Terrell actually has a question for Lyle. Lyle, did the purchasing of Bacchus by Morgan significantly increase the value and uniqueness of Bacchus in relation to his more ancient restoration history?
Hi, thank you. It's hard to say. I mean, I would say no in terms of currency. The value in 1936, Morgan paid 36,000 pounds, and I did the calculation in equivalent to about 2,250,000 pounds today. But then in 1949, the sculpture sold at the Brummer sale for $1,500. And that then in 1956, we acquired it for a couple of $1,000. No, yeah, a couple of $1,000. And so I think that there was really it declined in value between 36 and 49, but I do think that the reason that it was desirable for us and for Valentiner was clearly its Morgan provenance. And of course, now I would say we would recognize it's worth far more than exponentially more than what the Raleigh Museum paid for it in 1956. And does that answer your question?
You also just got another, yes, Andrew says yes. And we got a question from Sarah Goforth. She is asking, how do you go about organizing, building these multinational, multidisciplinary teams to work on such a project? What drives these kind of projects? So I guess this is maybe Caroline. Anybody want to take a stab at this?
I think more and more it's important to have multidisciplinary studies on works of art to get, just like today, for example, from a stylistic analysis, Fernando talks about Bacchus dating to the current iteration of Bacchus dating to the neoclassical period. And we see that in Jennifer's scientific analysis. So it's nice to have confirmation of ideas coming from multiple points of view. Organizing such a big project, it takes time. It takes a lot of connections, trying to find the right people to help answer all the myriad questions we may have. I mean, the Bacchus Conservation Project has lasted 7 years. And a lot of it was waiting for funding to actually be able to do these things and bring in the scholars to take a look at the statue. So they're a good thing. They're a bit hard to organize because you really need funding. We could not have done this without Bank of America, without the IMLS, Don Davis and Peggy Wilkes, Stephen Frozingzais, who are our major sponsors for this project. Just on the museum's regular budget, forget it, it's not happening. So we were extremely lucky for that.
And we got a question from Noel for Lyle, if World War II would have anything to do with.
Yes, I was just typing a reply to say, yes, thank you for that. Absolutely. When the Morgan Library sold the sculpture in 1945, that was really a devastating event and had a major impact on the valuation of art. And I'm going to actually do some calculations and get back to you on the really, I'm very curious to see how the fluctuation of price it reflects both the economic and geopolitical events, but also as compared to the relative value of the currency today. But I will say that also it was important that after World War II, yes, that is why the NCMA ended up with such a great collection, because we were buying in the early 1950s, and there were a lot of people selling art, especially in England, selling their collections of old master paintings and so forth. So thank you. Yes, World War II was a major factor.
And we have another question from Michael Stone. Is the future plan to keep Bacchus in Raleigh?
Oh yes, he's not going anywhere.
He's not traveling.
He's not going anywhere, except, well, right now he's on view in the Bacchus Conservation Project exhibition. And after that, Bacchus will return to the galleries, and we will put him for the very, very first we say him, he's our friend. He's a real person. We'll put him in the classical galleries, and we have a digital app that will accompany the statue wherever it goes. And that will give you the very complex and fascinating history that clearly does not fit on a small, tiny label. So Bacchus, yes, he's not going anywhere. He's staying in Raleigh.
And it looks like Lyle has a question for Mark.
Yes, so Mark, what do you make of the statement of Canessa that the Bacchus was excavated at Antium?
Great question. I'll go first, and then I'm eager to hear what Fernando has to say. I mean,
So, say again.
I said, great question, burning question.
Yeah.
And I can go first, and I'd invite Fernando to weigh in here. So we know that Marco Sitio El Temps was involved in explorations, let's not call them really excavations, in and around Rome. The best documented, if you can even use that term, is at the villa that he's building at Mondragone, which is near Frascati. We don't have, to my knowledge, any association with him conducting anything at Antium, Anzio. And I have to say that I think we have to be skeptical, about how the Canessa brothers knew such an association. If you know it's from the Palazzo El Temps and you're 16th, early 17th century, Anzio is like in the 16th century, you have all the good finds are from there. So you've got, the Apollo Belvedere, which you showed, Lyle. You've got the Farnese warrior gladiator that's now in the Louvre. It's almost like Anzio is what Hadrian's Villa is to the 18th century. So I'm suspicious. Another question here, of course, is where are the other two statues? And they're in the Palazzo El Temps, the other two statues that Morgan acquired. It makes sense that he would be able to purchase them after 1894, when the El Temps becomes owned by the Holy See. There's a real migration of the existing statuary. We have them in the Palazzo El Temps inventories. We don't have images of them historically. They're not in Clarac. So where are they?
Right.
They're probably out there, just unrecognized. So that's a fascinating story and tale to investigate.
A project.
That's a project.
New project.
Yeah, if I can say just a few words, the provenance from Anzio sounds like kind of a guarantee of quality, because of course they wanted to sell it as a good piece, as a good ancient marble. And Imperial Anzio was so, as Mark said, was so full of masterpieces that we have to be very skeptical.
Yes.
But I also would like to add something as a specialist of composite sculpture, as Caroline said. She was extremely, she was extremely brave. I really appreciate the courage Caroline had in making this happen and create this project, because the re-restoration of an ancient piece is something that goes really against the grain right now. Many museums are still de-restoring ancient sculptures, and this actually does not respect the history of the statues themselves. So statues are not only originals, but they also have stories, and I think that we have to respect those stories, and I think that the Bacchus project did that. That's the reason why I was so happy to participate in it. Thank you.
Okay, well, we are going to have a 20-minute break. So let's come back at 12, should we do 12:50, Caroline, or 12:45?
I would say 12:45,
Okay.
just because some people might want to come and expect us to start then. So a slightly shorter break, but yeah, so we'll come back at 12:45.
All right, and we have a illustrated history of the Bacchus Conservation Project, a presentation that I'm going to put on. So if you want to go grab some snacks, we'll play that presentation and you can come and join us and watch it. Okay. All right, is everybody back?
I'm back.
Hope you all had a chance to take a bathroom break, get some more snacks, more water, stay hydrated. We still have a couple more presentations to go. Okay, well, I think we can get started. Caroline?
Perfect. Okay, for the second part of today's program, we're now leaving the scholarly and scientific research portion. We're moving into the restoration and conservation treatment. Our first speaker is going to be David Bassett, who is Chief Technology Officer at ScanSite. And ScanSite was really the first consultant to start the project with us with a 3D structured light scan of all the fragments of Bacchus. David, the floor is yours.
Very good, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to be discussing the applications of structured light 3D scanning for the Bacchus project. My name is Dave Bassett. My company is ScanSite. We're located in San Rafael, California. We're a provider of 3D scanning services. So in 2018, we were commissioned to come to Raleigh to scan the Bacchus sculpture and to create a 3D digital model. Now, there were several reasons why we wanted to create this model. One is archival. It's always a good idea to have a documented model of an art object. But in this case, we were getting ready to make some changes. So it was extra important to have a really high quality 3D model. Secondly, there were a lot of tools that would be activated once we had a 3D digital model. For example, we could analyze the area, the volume, we could do structural analysis. We could even send it to a 3D printer once we had this model. Third, we knew we wanted to digitally reassemble the model. And by having a 3D digital model, we could do this digitally and not actually touch the physical statue while doing it. And fourth, we knew we also wanted to end up with a color 3D model for the interactive. And it's a great way to start a color model by creating a 3D model. So this is the structured light 3D scanner that we brought to the museum. This is a Breukman stereo scan. It's a very high quality structured light 3D scanner. It's normally used in aerospace, automotive. Here you can see it scanning a very small metal part. It's a 5 megapixel scanner, which means that it gets 5 million points per scan. The way it works is, in the middle, we have a fringe projector. That's that silver box in the background. That projects a structured light fringe onto the object being scanned. Here you can see the pattern being projected onto this part. During the scanning process, that fringe pattern will change maybe 50 times. On your left here, you see one video camera. On the right, you see another. These video cameras are watching the fringe pattern change on the object, and with lots of computational power, they're able to use that to interpolate a 3D model. So here you see the fringe pattern being projected onto Bacchus. One takeaway here is that those lines are actually coming out of the projector as parallel and straight, and yet when they hit Bacchus, you can see they're deforming to his shape. And this tells you how this works. The video cameras are watching this from different angles and interpolating the 3D shape. So here we have a little bit of a zoom in on what these lines really look like close up. And when I first saw structured light scanning, I wondered, well, how can you interpolate a sub-millimeter 3D model from these lines, which look kind of fuzzy and they're 3 or 4 millimeters across. The answer is that the scanner is actually seeing in the middle of those lines an extremely thin, dark line, and that's what it's interpolating its information from. And when we look at 3D scan data on the computer screen, we see something like this. This is a really beautiful surface to look at. But what actually are we looking at here? The scanner creates something called a point cloud. And I'm going to turn the points on now. You can see in this model, there are about 35 million of these points. And I could click on any one of these points and the software could tell me out to about 12 decimal points where that position lies in 3D space. It would give me the X, Y, Z coordinates. You can also see that there are a great many of these points. They're very close together. A lot of these points are only 50 microns apart. So you might wonder, why do we need so many points so close together? Well, in the case of Bacchus, we were trying to capture things like hairline cracks, abrasions, scratches, all sorts of really tiny features. And so in order to create or to capture tiny features, you need a lot of points really close together. So this model is what we would call a high resolution 3D scan model. And there's one problem with a point cloud, and that is that it's just that, it's a cloud. And you can think of it as points floating in space with nothing in between. So it has no surface area. So in order to make the model more useful to us, we need to create a surface area. So the software does something called polygonization. And that's where it connects all these dots with lines called vertices. And once that happens, we end up with a model containing millions and millions of polygons, which in this case are triangles. So we're going to see the software polygonize the model right now. So this is what you're actually looking at when you look at 3D scan data on the screen. And this model has the qualities we want. It has surface area. We can calculate the volume. We can send it to a 3D printer. We can do all sorts of structural analysis, finite element analysis. But we normally keep these turned off because they're kind of distracting and they don't really help us to study the object as we're seeing it here. And so this is the complete model of all the pieces that we scanned. You can see at the top, you have the head, leaves, berries, and hair pieces. And these were disassembled when we came to the museum. So each one of these was a separate scanning project. And then down below, you have the torso, limbs, and base. And this was all connected just as you see it here when we scanned it. So I mentioned that having a 3D digital model enables a lot of useful tools. Well, one example is that we knew we wanted to digitally reassemble this model. And by doing it digitally, we could assemble it and try different scenarios without ever touching the model physically. So this is a real advantage. You can even have multiple people working on the same problem when you have a digital model. So here we're going to move the head into its approximate location. Now I'm moving it very quickly here, but the software has tools which enable us to move it just 1 micron at a time if we want, and also to rotate it. Another really useful tool that having a digital model enables is what we call best fit of matching surfaces. So in this case, you can see the bottom of the neck and the torso that we know were once connected. The computer can actually look at these surfaces and try to tell us how they best fit together. Now, this may not be exactly the correct solution, but it's very helpful and it gets us down the road. So finally, we ended up with this color model, which was used for the interactive. Now, this was a 3-step process. We took the scan data that you see in the previous slides. We merged it into a single block. Then the museum staff took hundreds of high-resolution photographs of Bacchus. And finally, we color mapped those photographs onto the 3D model. We came up with this model, which was used in the interactive. So that concludes my presentation. I thank you all for watching, and I'll be around for the question and answer session later.
Thank you very much, David, for starting this first paper on the second session with something that a lot of people have asked us about. How did you 3D scan the statue? Well, now they know. We're going to move to our second speaker, who actually used for his work your 3D scan of the statue. Our next speaker is Andrew Terrell from Lysat and Associates Structural Engineers. And he's the person we went to when we started the project asking, can we do this de-restoration? Can we complete what had been started in the 80s? And he said, yes, you can de-restore, but no, you cannot reconstruct a recreation of Bacchus with the remaining limbs. So we went for plan B, and plan B, he said, you're all good to go with restoring the statue. So I will let Andy tell us all about his process.
All right. That was a great introduction, Caroline. Hi, everyone. I'm Andrew Terrell with Lysat and Associates Structural Engineers, and I was responsible for the structural analysis of Bacchus. So how does structural engineering relate to Bacchus? Well, structural engineering is a branch of civil engineering that's primarily focused on structures. We deal with elevated loads, the weight of the building, the weight of the people in the building, that has to transfer through a structural frame safely to a foundation. Well, similarly, Bacchus has an elevated weight of his torso. He has the left arm, and any changes we might make during the restoration that need to transfer safely and stably through his frame, his legs, into his foundation. So we can use some of our structural analysis tools to analyze Bacchus. So what are those tools? Well, those are our structural analysis methods. And we considered two for Bacchus. The first was a finite element analysis. In a finite element analysis, you can take a complex geometry and you can break it down into small parts or a mesh. You can apply loads and restraints to different parts of that mesh. You apply materials to the mesh, and you can actually see how it deforms, how it develops internal stresses and strains. And those can be used to see, is my model going to break, as opposed to actually load testing what you're trying to look at. So that's finite element analysis. Our second considered analysis method was a structural frame analysis. This is more common for structures and buildings. But we take frame members that are connected between nodes. You can apply loads to the frame members. You can restrain or support their end nodes. You can connect multiple frame members together with rigidity across that joint. And then we apply some classic structural engineering concepts like mechanics of materials and the Euler-Bernoulli beam theory to run analysis and determine forces, moments, internal stresses, and reactions for those structural frames. So, of those options, we had to consider which one was best for Bacchus. And it was actually a structural frame analysis. Now, if Bacchus was a solid piece of marble, a finite element analysis would have been a great tool and definitely the better approach for Bacchus. But he's not. As we've talked about all morning, Bacchus is a composite sculpture of multiple pieces of marble that were restored sometime or several times throughout history. But as such, we have some limited information on what joins him together. And we got that from gamma radiograph scans of his joints. So we can tell that there are some internal rods. There's even some clamps that hold him together. There's internal screws throughout. And we have information on what's there, but it's not enough for a detailed finite element analysis. But it was enough to tell us that those joints are going to be the weak points of Bacchus. He's not, they're going to be weaker than the marble elements of his frame. So a frame analysis will do a good job of spreading the load through his frame and telling us what forces and moments need to transfer across these critical joints. So how do we go about a structural frame analysis? So a structural frame analysis I've shown here for Bacchus or for a more common structural application like a stair tower. You start with reality. For Bacchus, we already have reality. For a more common structural application, we might be trying to make reality, but we have something that we're trying to create. We need to create a geometric model of that models its geometry in 3D space. After we create that geometric model, we can create an analytical model that matches the locations of the geometric model, but we can apply member stiffnesses and materials to our frame members. We can apply restraints at our nodes. We can apply our forces, and then we can analyze and determine how the force will flow through the frame and what our reactions will be. And that's the information we'll use to design our structure, or in this case, to evaluate Bacchus. So our first step, we need to create a geometric model. Well, for Bacchus, that would be extremely difficult to do. And in my opinion, is part of the reason the Bacchus conservation process had to be pushed back to a time when something like a fractured light scan could be done. David's lecture before this was extremely eye-opening, and I loved hearing him talk about the millions and millions of points even just in the head. But his fractured light scan is what enabled us to create an accurate geometric model that we could then turn into an analytical model. So we took his 3D map scan into what's called a stereolithography file, and like he discussed, we have a point cloud of nodes in three-dimensional Cartesian coordinate system, an XYZ coordinate system. And those nodes can be mapped with a triangular mesh to create a surface. This is actually somewhat similar to our finite element analysis process. And that mesh can then be imported into a geometric modeling software. And within that geometric modeling software, we can then actually break Bacchus into his constituent parts that have already been restored. So we broke him into a torso, a left arm, his legs, and then his tree and pedestal. And that's important because then we can do our geometric analysis on Bacchus as a whole, but also on Bacchus as a part. So we can determine volumes, we can determine weights, and center of gravities within our 3D coordinate system of each of his individual parts. And that will help us then develop tools to get that information transferred into our analytical models to get us the information we need to evaluate and design. So after we have a geometric model, we need to create an analytical model. The first step to that is finding where those critical nodes are. That would be his center of gravity and really the joints along his structural frame. We do that from our geometric model. And then we can connect those nodes in 3D space with frame members that have material properties and stiffnesses mimicking the marble. And then we connect those frame members across his joints with relative stiffness to the joint that is our best estimation of the internal connection of Bacchus. So after we do that, we can then apply our loads and our restraints to the frame of Bacchus, and we can see what happens. Our model will analyze and tell us what axial forces, what shear forces, what bending moments develop through our members. It'll give us a load path to see how does load or how does weight want to get from Bacchus's upper torso down to his foundation. And most importantly, it'll give us information about what forces and moments we really need to transfer across these critical joints. All right, so before I even get into the findings of our structural analysis, I want to talk about how an engineer, when he approaches a problem, should already have an idea of a solution before he ever gets into an analysis model. So for us, we looked at Bacchus, we looked at him closely, and just as everyone's discussed, it was pretty obvious that he's got joints, and he's got a right leg that's got some issues. It's got a kind of a weakened right thigh to torso joint that's got some cracking. We were concerned about his right ankle joint. We were also concerned about his left leg to tree joint, but most importantly, we were concerned about his right knee, which had some cracking and then also some internal dowels bridging the calf into the thigh. So we were concerned about increasing load to that right side. And I'm going to mimic Bacchus here. If you want to look at my screen for a second, and I'd even encourage you, if you want to do this, it's a really good way to feel what Bacchus feels. But if you stand like Bacchus and you put all your weight on your left leg, you bend your right leg, extend your left arm, you can pretend you don't have a right arm or a head, you naturally come to a place where all your weight wants to go through your left leg. But if you extend your right arm out like we're going to for Bacchus, your weight wants to shift to the right. And to compensate for that, your right leg is going to counterbalance and pick up force from that shift of your center of gravity to the right side. And that's what we were trying to avoid with Bacchus, because we were concerned it could destabilize his right knee. So based on our structural analysis models, which confirmed what we originally thought, and our analysis models and our preliminary concerns, we came up with 2 recommendations for the conservation team. And the first was that we need to limit the weight that goes back on Bacchus. The second is that we need to limit anything that would shift his center of gravity to the right and forward in Bacchus, because that would increase load to that right leg. So they wanted to reattach the head, which we can't really control the weight on. It's about 55 pounds, but luckily Bacchus's head is centered over his center of gravity. If anything, it's even a little to the left. And when we included the head in our analysis models, it caused very minimal change through his right leg. But if we were to attach a marble right arm, it would be about 43 pounds and cause significant increase in the load to go through the right leg. And we were very concerned that would destabilize the knee. So our recommendation was that any right arm that needs to go back on Bacchus should be lightweight. It should not be created of marble. So the conservation team commissioned Larry Hayda, who will speak next, to create a new arm, but they challenged him to create it with lightweight materials. And to do that, Larry really wanted a model that he could use in creating this new right arm. And I also needed a model to finish my geometric and analytical models of this right arm. But Bacchus is not an everyday person. Bacchus is about 6'9". He's well built. I mean, there's not a lot of those guys walking around, especially that will let you sit down and scan their arm for over an hour. So the conservation team reached out to North Carolina State and their men's basketball team, and thankfully Wyatt Walker sat down with us and let us scan his arm, which Larry then will use to create his sculpture. He'll talk more about that in a few minutes. And then I used also in our analytical model, our geometric and analytical models for Bacchus. So now that we have information on the head and the right arm, we create complementary analysis models comparing the original condition, the addition of the head to the model, and then the addition of the right arm. And we compared the forces that transferred through the body, focusing on that right leg. And we found that by making that arm lightweight, we reduced the arm from about 43 pounds down to about 9 pounds. And that decrease greatly reduced the effect of additional load on the right knee. So that's structural engineering in Bacchus. We were able to aid the conservation team by evaluating Bacchus's current condition, but we were also able to help maintain Bacchus's structural integrity during the restoration process. I also would like to say thank you to the rest of the conservation team and all the other scholars that are speaking today. This has been a very enlightening, it's been a great experience throughout the whole process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Andy. We could not have done this without you. Bacchus may not have survived without your structural engineering council.
I appreciate that.
Our next speaker, as Andy mentioned, will be Larry Hayda, who is a multimedia artist specialized in the human form and who also has an engineering background. And Larry will tell us all about his process of creating Bacchus's new right arm. The floor is yours, Larry.
Okay, I thought I should mention, first of all, how I came in touch with Bacchus. I do a lot of oil painting as well as sculpture, and I had done a copy of a 15th century painting by Roger van der Weyden in the Prado, full size, 7 feet tall and 8.5 feet wide. And when I finished it, Noelle Oken came out to see it at the church I made it for. And she was so kind that she invited us to, my wife and I, to visit the conservation lab. So we were taking a tour around the conservation lab, and of course, we saw this noble figure of Bacchus standing there. And I think it was Caroline that told me that they'd like to put another arm on it, but they're really afraid of using a completely marble arm because of the factors that Andy just discussed, 46 pounds. And so I said I can make it out of fiberglass and imitate the texture and color of the marble, and it shouldn't weigh anywhere close to 46 pounds. So that's what started us off. A couple months after that meeting, I had a contract in hand, and I was ready to start on the sculpture. Uh-oh, how do I do this? Okay, here we go. So normally, if I do a project like this, I have a standard method. I mean, I've done hundreds of sculptures over the last 50 years in America and Europe and all kinds of movie stars and politicians and so on. And it's amazing that of all these sculptures I've done in my entire career, only one sculpture was done with the person sitting in front of me while I sculpted from him. Everything else has been done with photographs. And there was a famous saying, I can't remember the sculptor back in the 1940s. He said, anybody who sculpts from photographs is crazy. So I guess that applies to me, but who has time to pose for a sculpture? Everybody's busy. And so again, I was going to find a model, photograph the model with the arm upraised, holding the grapes, sculpt the arm with oil-based clay, with an armature inside. Of course, I would 3D print the full-size shoulder section of the scan site data. Thank you so much for that. That was an incredible thing to have at my disposal. I have a full Bacchus on my mesh mixer right now. I can pull up any part of it. So that was an incredible thing to have. So anyway, once I would sculpt the arm out of oil-based clay and make a silicone mold and cast the arm in fiberglass. That was the program, and I expected to do that. But when I actually found my model, everything changed. And finding a model wasn't so easy. You try to approach somebody, can you model for me for a naked Greek god, Roman god, and they'll run the other way. So I decided to find a model with the same height as Bacchus, because that would provide me with an arm of the right size and proportion. So the model search began. Oh, I found a perfect model for the face of Bacchus. And I know this is kind of funny and trivial, but it's interesting that Elvis has classical features. I mean, notice the small mouth there, and the deep set eyes, the broad forehead, the long nose, the shape of the face. It's almost identical to Bacchus's face. And it could be one of the reasons that the king became so famous. He had classical features. So anyway, I was still looking for a model, and I thought about are there any tall men's societies in North Carolina? Is that how I find the model? But the prospect of approaching a prospective model arm building with a picture of a naked Roman wine god was daunting indeed. So I gave up on that pretty fast. So then I had an awakening. I was searching the net, a light came on, I need a basketball player. And after scouring through college basketball rosters all over the state, rosters from small colleges, large colleges, and I went through all of them looking for basketball players 6'9" or 6'8". And I wrote to the coaches. I spent weeks doing this, and I got no replies from anybody. It was amazing. Until I wrote to Dawn Winters at NCSU. And she was so fantastic. She wrote back to me right away. She said, this is an incredible project. I'll talk to Coach Kevin Keats about it. And right away, she got permission to use Wyatt Walker for the photo session. And we were in business. We had a model, and the session went incredibly well. I built a special chair for Wyatt to sit in that had telescoping armrests to keep his arm relatively immobile during the scanning process. Oh, the scan was actually a second thought. I was going to do everything with photography, but I had a friend in Greensboro, Heather Pendrack, and a couple of days before the meeting, I called her up and I said, why don't you bring your scanner? So here she is scanning Wyatt's arm. And he was an amazing guy. I mean, he held that arm up there for at least 10 minutes. At one point, Heather got on a chair because he was so tall. And in getting on the chair, she pulled out one of her wires from her computer. And so she had to recalibrate everything. And in the meantime, Wyatt kept his hand up. And if anybody's ever tried to raise their hand over their head for even 1 minute, you'll notice how the blood goes out. And I can't imagine what Wyatt had to endure for 10. But he was a super sport, and we got a good scan. So I'm covering up. I don't know if you can see this. Whoops. Uh-oh. Okay. Anyway, there was a picture on the right side. Is that visible to anybody else? I don't know. Can I move this? Oh, I can move it. Okay. All right. So the mini arm turns into a full-sized arm. I also had my mini structured light sensor, David, an iScan S, and it also projected line patterns, moving line patterns on the little arm, because we made the mini Bacchus first, and I used this. Basically, I printed out Bacchus at 28%, and I printed out Wyatt's arm at 28%, and then I used the small arm and the small Bacchus to do all the adaptation of the arm to the shoulder. And of course, the scanner kind of oversimplified the hands and the grapes, and that all had to be resculpted. But here's the scanner in business, and you see the digital image on the screen. This is a 3D print of the bottom section of Wyatt's arm. Just see how huge that arm was. It was 3 feet long, this thing. So this is the bottom section. You can see the little stub that plugs into the shoulder. Okay, it's not taking. Oh, here we are. Okay, here's this is what I had to contend with when I got the digital file from Heather Pendrak. This was Wyatt's arm, and this was Bacchus, and I had to somehow or another merge that arm into the shoulder. And I was not allowed to touch the sculpture in any way. It's not like I could make the arm almost fit and then sand a little bit off the shoulder to make it fit better. Everything had to be done on the arm. So obviously I shaved off a lot here. I added to the deltoid. A lot of changes were made. And again, then I had to create this little plug to fit into Bacchus's shoulder. And again, you can see the hands. The hands were rough, to say the least, and I had to redo those. So I sculpted the hand. You can see it up here. I strengthened a lot of the features of the hand so it would look more like classical sculpture. In many of Michelangelo's pieces, you can see the squared off knuckles, and the tendons on the back of the hand are more prominent to lend some vigor to the hand. And so the hand was sculpted, and then about 45 grapes were rolled out in clay and attached with little finishing nails. And once the hand was finished, we cut off the old hand from the scan and attached it to the new arm. And then the mold was made. So in order to make this arm very light, if I had just cast it in fiberglass resin, or we ultimately went to urethane resin, it would have been very, very heavy. I don't know if it would have been as heavy as marble, but it would have been very heavy. And so what I did was create a core inside the mold, and the core was made out of 4-pound density rigid urethane foam. That's a very lightweight foam, and it was covered with a light layer of fiberglass so that the resin wouldn't soak into it. So you can see a steel rod going through the center of the core, which goes all the way down to the plug and goes all the way into the wrist of the hand. And the core allows about 1/4 of an inch of space between the walls of the mold and the core for the resin to flow into. Now, originally we were going to use, that might be in the next slide. Okay. Originally we're going to use fiberglass resin, UV inhibited fiberglass resin, but all the UV inhibitors in the fiberglass resin turned it slightly green. And so I was unable to make a perfect color match with Bacchus's body. So we had to switch our game plan, and I came up with a polyurethane resin from BJB Industries out in Tustin, California. And that was a water clear resin, and I used pigments from another company called Smooth On up in Pennsylvania. And we got the color just right. it matched Bacchus's body pretty well. And so this is the pouring process. That was a vacuum chamber, suck all the air bubbles out of the resin. This is a little speeded up. Actually, we did 3 pours to fill this mold. You can see the mother mold around the blue silicone mold. There's a cap to keep the resin from coming out when I tilt it. Because we had all these grapes on the far end of the mold there, and the grapes would tend to create air pockets. So I had to move it around quite a bit so that all the grapes filled up. And once we were in business, we filled it up a little bit more because some of the grapes had absorbed some of the resin too. So that was our pour. And oops, okay. Okay, here's the final finishing of the arm. I'm taking the arm of the mold in this picture. You can see the pouring sprue right there. That, of course, got cut off. And we had to take out the screws that held the core in and fill the holes and so on, sand it all down. And once it was all sanded, I brought it to the museum and I painted some nice splotchy browns on it to match the body of Bacchus. And there we went, and we had a finished sculpture. And whoops, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much, Larry, for creating this lovely arm for Bacchus. Our next speaker will use your arm to complete the restoration. And our next speaker, we're skipping the 5-minute break because we're running a little bit late. Corey Smith Riley, who is the museum's objects conservator. She started out as a consultant with the project, but eventually when a position opened at the museum for an objects conservator, she applied for it, and she is now the museum's first objects conservator, and she's the one who took care of putting Bacchus together again. Corey, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Hello, everyone. It's very fitting for my presentation to come at the end of this Scholars Day, full of all of my colleagues and the projects they have presented, because each and every one of the presentations today adapted and influenced our conservation treatment. So this was a really overall presentation today, just through the whole process that we went through in order to bring Bacchus back. So I am Corey Riley. I'm the objects conservator at the North Carolina Museum of Art. I've been at the museum for 2.5 years, as Caroline was saying. And previously, it had only been a paintings conservation lab. And so all of the paintings conservators were very kind to adapt to larger, wider, and more cumbersome pieces of artwork, much like Bacchus. And on my very first day coming to the museum, Bacchus was there for me. Let me see, here we go. He was already in the lab. The head had been detached by the Fogg Center for Conservation in 1983. It was on exhibition in the classical galleries. What we call the bits and bobs, all the berries and hair, had been removed by Linda Roundhill in 1988. And I will give her props because her extensive conservation report provide a wealth of information for this project as well. And Bacchus stood as a sculpture made out of 7 different pieces of marble. So I've drawn red lines on here delineating the different pieces, the joins that you could see. It was very clear where these things were going together. They were not, at this point, in disguise. We did not think it was one piece of marble, but the first step was that we had to figure out how they were being held together. So we had a company called Baker Testing conduct gamma radiography on Bacchus, and we were able to find many, many pieces of metal in each of the joints. There were pins and bullets and staples and screws and all kinds of things in there that were not visible from the outside of the sculpture, but really did influence the choices that we made in the conservation treatment. Both, like Andy was saying, the knee that you see on the lower left-hand side was extremely delicate. And I was very concerned that any movement or stress put onto the sculpture itself would cause damage to this knee, and we did not want that to happen. When we did the gamma ray, we had to do it down in the boiler room of the museum because they brought in a radioactive source. We had to make sure that no one was around, and it was on a day that we were closed on a Monday. And so we were able to really identify what was going on inside of the sculpture, as you see here. But as all the rest of this scholarship was going on, as the provenance was being traced, as everyone was working on their different individual pieces, we started really the treatment of the sculpture. So the first step was to clean the marble pieces. We started first with these Mars plastic erasers. They're really quite wonderful and my favorite treatment to use for marble. People are either horrified or thrilled to learn that what is combined with these erasers is using saliva, which I tend to call personal enzymatic solution because it sounds a lot fancier. But the combination of the two really gives you a controlled cleaning, and it's very, very gentle. So you're able to clean areas with less surface dirt more gently, whereas areas with more significant surface grime can be cleaned to a better extent, really unifying the sculpture slowly with these erasers. The erasers weren't able to do everything, and so we're lucky enough in the lab right now to have an ND YAG laser, which is by Compact Phoenix Laser from Linton Conservation. We ended up using these on the leaves and berries, which Scott had determined were Carrara marble, so they were most likely not ancient. And then also on the base, which through Fernando's research, with the tool marks on the side of it, had been heavily reworked, probably in neoclassical times. So we know that neither one of these were ancient surfaces that hadn't been reworked or changed significantly. So we weren't as worried about over cleaning these. If you can see the picture on the right, the area in the top of the base is where it is uncleaned, and the area on the lower side is where it is clean. So it did a wonderful job. Lasers use structured light to clean the dirt off the surface by ablating or vaporizing the dirt layer. I like to tease everyone because the ND YAG laser, which we use in objects conservation, is the same crystalline laser that's used in tattoo removal. So if you imagine a dark surface being removed from something lighter, the paintings conservators in the lab have an erbium YAG laser, which is a different crystal, but that's the laser that's used in beauty mark removal and more spa treatments. So we have it all in the lab right now. Something interesting about the laser cleaning that we weren't expecting was that the leaves and the berries had this orange tone to them when we were done, which was not acceptable. And anecdotally, talking to a number of people who have used the lasers on stone in the past, we think that was probably some of the wax layers, some of the organic treatments that were put onto the sculpture that turned orange after using the laser. And wonderfully, this agarose gel, which is made from agar, which comes from the red algae, was able to remove it. So much like Jen was telling you about the poultices of clay that were used previously, this is one that's made out of this agar gel. So it's very, very clean, and it does not soak into the marble. It pulls everything else without leaving a trace behind, which is wonderful. And if you see the used gel on the right, you see that orange tone to it. That's what we were removing from the surface. It really was just a wax or a surface treatment that had discolored. So after talking with Andy extensively and realizing that the right knee was going to be heavily compromised if we did take off the torso as the original plan was, we decided that we would need to be putting Bacchus back together. Fernando has a really wonderful perspective that, you know, all of the times of the periods of the sculpture are important, and we need to honor those and really highlight them in our educational components and the story of Bacchus itself. And so since we have such a valuable and interesting provenance going from Palazzo Temps through Canessa to JP Morgan, we don't want to ignore that and only focus on the ancient components. Bacchus as a sculpture is also extremely important with his ancient pieces inside. And so we really took this approach to bringing Bacchus back to the way he was when he came back into the collection. So how will we do that? Let me see if I can get here. There we go. A lot of the choices we made for conservation materials are all based on the incredible research that Carolyn Riccadelli did at the Metropolitan Museum of Art on the conservation treatment of Tullio Lombardi's Adam. This is a sculpture that fell over in 2002, and between 2002 and 2014, they put it back together in tremendous research done into adhesives and pins and everything that would be used on a conservation treatment like this. So this is such a wonderful project to be able to base our choices on, knowing that they had done extensive research into the right selections. So for the adhesives, we used acrylic resins, a 3:1 paraloid B72, paraloid 48N, B48N. The adhesives are chemically stable, meaning that they will be reversible in the future. They won't yellow over time, and they have a good strength and minimal creep. So the creep would be the heaviness of the marble won't be able to pull at the join and have it move at all. The pins, as you saw in our gamma ray photographs, there are pins and clamps and all kinds of things inside of Bacchus. Pins have been used extensively in restorations for hundreds of years. And the history of pins is actually really fascinating because in Florentine tradition, they would use a copper alloy pin, where just down south of there in Rome in the 17th century, they often used iron pins. So it was very regional. The pin here you see on the left is a square profiled iron pin that was removed from during treatment. It was in the leaf that you see on the right there. But because iron, if it is exposed to moisture or high humidity, it will expand and the corrosion product becomes larger than the iron itself, thereby causing stress and strain on the marble and possible cracking. We would never use iron today. But what the Met ended up finding was this wonderful fiberglass reinforced polyester pins. So they are completely synthetic. They will not corrode, they will not change over time, but they also have these fibers running through it. So should there be a break in the future, the fibers really will hold on and crimp rather than having it snap and cause further damage. Now, some of the pins and metal components we did use again. So these are older copper alloy staples that came out of the bottom of the head. Linda Roundhill moved them in 1988. And because they were such a perfect fit for the cavities that were carved in the bottom of the head, we ended up reusing these. So the copper alloy is going to be stable. We did coat them in a barrier material so that they are more stable than they would be. But they fit so perfectly that it was just the only solution to reuse these to secure the pieces of marble in the neck. But pinning the head was quite an ordeal to try to discuss. So we used a lot of Andy's knowledge of engineering. He created the 3D head body alignment picture here on the left. And what was interesting is that the hole going into the head and the hole going into the neck were not matching up in alignment. It was not a straight line. And so it became very clear that we were going to have to use something a little bit smaller than what was available there. And in Linda Roundhill's conservation treatment, she mentions that she removed one very large copper alloy pin bent in the middle, secured into the hole in the bottom of the head with tightly packed sulfur. So unfortunately, we don't have the pin itself that was removed, but we realized that this is why it was bent, because these holes did not have correct alignment in a straight line. And so in order to select what size pin, when the Met was working with scientists at Princeton University, they came up with this ideal ratio for a pin that holds marble pieces together with an 8:1 ratio. It's based on fracture mechanics with the idea that the ideal pin length creates an effective mechanical connection between two marble fragments without being so long as to cause stress points on either end. So we went along with this 8:1 ratio. We selected a 2.5-inch long pin And everyone was very, very concerned that this was too small. But Andy, with all of his structural analysis, stated for me that, I quote, based on the weight of the head and Bacchus's geometry, the 5/16 structural fiberglass exceeds the required shear capacity of the join with an approximate safety factor of 100. So I was able to say, Andy, our engineer, says it's fine. We are good to go. One of the steps that we did say that we would use is that we ended up using a potted pin. The term potted pin in conservation means that the pin is adhered into one side of the joint. So we adhered it into the head, where we also created a sleeve in the body. So we cast a sleeve that fit the pin specifically into the neck, so that when the head fit on in the correct orientation, the pin would hold it in the right manner. And this would make it reversible, more easily reversible in the future. So the head had to be reattached. This giant gantry was in the conservation studio for many, many months. The art handlers at our museum created a sling for the head that had 4 points of micro adjustment so that we could get the exact angle appropriate to have it hold in place. We used the 3D scan prints, or the 3D prints, quite a bit because we had a giant head of Bacchus printed. It was much easier to use that, positioning it on the neck to get approval from Caroline, the curator, rather than having the head itself above. So we had it all planned, we had it structurally stable, and the head had to stay supported in this gantry for 3 months while the solvents for the adhesives evaporated, and we knew that it would be structurally sound to take it out of the gantry itself. And once we did that, we also realized that the mullets had to go on afterwards. So the mullet is actually an important piece structurally. Remember, the head is from Thasos, the island in the north of the Aegean. The torso is from Turkey, and the mullet is probably is Carrara, so from Italy. Most likely it's post-antique, but it is a wonderful triangle piece. So you see here in the lower right corner, it's a triangle of stone that fits into a loss where the head and the body come together. And it's very structurally important because it locks the head into place. Because it was carved from a different piece of stone, the joint is not perfect. And so we wanted to make it a much tighter join, and we ended up making an epoxy fragment to fit inside there. So we took epoxy putty and pushed it between 2 pieces of saran wrap, put the mullet in place. So we had a fragment that fit the void perfectly. And so when we adhered all of them together, the joints were much tighter and much more stable because the mullet was so important to structural stability of the head join onto the body. And then once the mullet was on, we started playing or filling all of the joins and in-painting them. So all of the joins on Bacchus, we used a slightly recessed fill, so very, very slightly recessed under the actual surface of the marble itself, but then painted them to match the marble. So what we wanted to do was, because we're telling the story of all these different pieces of stone, we're telling the story about all these different ancient sculptures and non-ancient sculptures put together in order to make the composite, we wanted to be able to have these joints detectable at a distance of about 6 inches. But when you stood back at about 6 feet from the sculpture, it was a unified sculpture. So aesthetically, the joints were not distracting. At a distance, you could appreciate the sculpture as Bacchus. But if you wanted to see where all these joints were, you'd be able to see them. And so we did this on all of the joints. So this is here in the leg on the back. On the left is before treatment. So this is how he looked when he came to me. And on the right is after treatment. So they just blend a little bit more, and they are identifiable, but not distracting. We used a bulked B72, so the same material that we're using for the adhesives, but it was bulked with fumed alumina, which is a powder that comes from London, and then in-painted them with Quar watercolors, which are my favorite in-painting medium at the moment. So they were a wonderful match for the stone as well. And so Bacchus was back in the state that he was when he came into the museum. But as you've heard from Andy and Larry, we also added an arm. So in the world of conservation, this is not a normal step. This is pretty drastic. And so I said, okay, this would be all right, but I had a number of requirements. One that Larry alluded to earlier is that he could not damage, change, or alter the stone itself of Bacchus. So there could be no changing the sculpture itself. And I wanted to use all of the let's see here. Oh, this was the other thing. So the archival evidence that both Lyle and Mark were presenting, there was enough evidence that the arm had existed. We weren't just making something out of thin air. We were basing it on historical information that we had been able to find, both an etching, which was great, but the black and white photograph was really the cinching idea that we could add this. We knew that it existed before. And so this is where my interest in attaching the arm was really important, because we used both the hole at the end of the shoulder and the L-shaped cavity at the back in order to attach the new arm. And so what we were able to do, and I'm still amazed that we were able to do it, is we were able to put the arm on without any adhesive at all. It is purely mechanically held onto the sculpture. Larry made it so that the metal staple that was holding on the arm is attached with a screw into the new arm, obviously not into the old body of Bacchus, but we were able to attach this completely mechanically so that it will be reversible in the future. So if anyone says, you're crazy, I can't believe guys added an arm, we'll say, well, we can reverse it. And I will tell you that, as Caroline said, he is now on exhibition in the East Building. And in order to get him into the West Building, which is where he will permanently be installed in the Classical Gallery, I'm going to have to take his arm off because now he is too tall to go through the hallways underneath the building. So I will be reversing it in about a year in order to move him back over and then putting the arm back on again. We also chose to make these joins much more obvious. So you can see a picture in the right here. You see the screw head, you see the joins, everything is available because we don't want to confuse anyone. We don't want to say this was original, this was neoclassical, this was, you know, part of Bacchus when he came in, because we have created this. This is entirely a new component, and we want that to be very clear to any visitors who see it. And so really it's much more obvious on the back. So if you go around to the back of Bacchus, you can see it more clearly. From the front, it blends a little bit more. And here is Bacchus with his new arm, all clean and everything back on. So this was really a tremendous treatment to be involved with. If you're interested more in conservation at the museum in general, we have a great 3D60 tour of the lab available online. Since we're all at home now, you can virtually go and visit the lab. And I'll be available for questions in the question and answer session after this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Corey, for showing us how you put Bacchus back together again. The next speaker is me. So I'm back. And what I wanted to do in just a few minutes is to give you the chance to look at the exhibition. When we planned Bacchus Scholars Day and we had to go virtual, we decided to include a little section on the exhibition because the museum was closed. We didn't know when we were going to open. Lo and behold, we opened just this past Wednesday. So those of you in Raleigh will be able to come and see the exhibition, but anybody else who does not want to travel or cannot travel, here's an example of a mini tour, a virtual tour of this exhibition. It has only one object, obviously Bacchus, one work of art, and it is extremely text heavy because we're trying to tell the story of the project, the story of the statue, and that's a lot of information. However, we were able to really design the labels and the text so that it's multi-layered, kind of like Bacchus, where if a person just wants to read the first paragraph all around, they get the gist of it. But if you want to dive down, you can do that as well. It starts with the torso. That's how the whole project started. So we do talk about that. And we have a section on the scholarly research that was presented today. And we even have books in the exhibition. This is the first time that the museum's Art Reference Library is lending books to an exhibition. And just for those of you concerned with conservation issues, those are actually copies of the pages that have been placed on the pages so that the pages of the book do not yellow during the run of the exhibition. We focus also on the scientific analysis that was presented this morning. That's on the videos, but we also have interactives for younger audiences. We have this wonderful analog interactive where you can create your own god. Bacchus is one of them, but this really plays into fragments, creating things from fragments and using the correct attributes to identify deities. If you're putting something from scratch, you want a Bacchus, you have to have grapes, you have to have the crown of ivy and berries, a cup, etc., etc. So that's interesting for younger families. There's also a panel on conservation, explaining what objects conservation is. The videos feature the people that you've seen speak today in longer sort of interview style. And the change of the project, the new plan, is featured on this wall in a different color panel right here. What happens? We had to change plan. Here's what we did instead. And this is really focused on the re-restoration and conservation of Bacchus. We also include in our big giant map an interactive that's all about marble analysis, looking at marble, looking for different features. This was very important to the project, so we wanted to teach that to a younger audience. We also wanted to talk about the other statues that have that torso that fit into a bigger statue type, where those are located. So on the map, you see where the quarries, where the marble comes from, but also those statues as well. And this is the interactive there right next to Bacchus. And this basically describes the project, offers a whole lot of information, videos, photos, about what you've seen today, the research that was done over the last 7 years. And this will follow Bacchus wherever he goes, because all that information cannot fit into one museum label. And we did not want Bacchus not to have that information. It was too important to the interpretation and understanding of the statue. Just showing our sponsors again: Bank of America, IMLS, Stephen Frozine Zeiss, Don Davis, and Peggy Wilkes. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We could not have done any of this without you. And we'll take a few questions from the audience if there are any. We have just a few minutes. But we have time for a few questions.
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. Marie Troxel would like to know, what was the most challenging piece of the Bacchus to restore? And on the flip side, was there a component that was surprisingly easy to restore?
That's interesting. So what I love to say is that when the head came off in the 1980s, we have the reports that say how it was done, and all they say is added water and lifted up with a gantry. So I think that was the easiest part to remove because it was very simple in 2 sentences. The hardest part was coming to terms with things that we couldn't clean. So when Jen presented some of the staining in the pectoral that was still yellow, there was no way to get that out because it had gone into the stone. And the stains on the right leg are actually interesting because Scott, I think, practically laughed at me when he came, because I was saying, well, what about these stains? How can I remove them? And he looked at me and he said, well, that's pentelic marble. Pentelic marble has mica running through it. Mica has a high iron content, and that's staining of the iron inside the stone, and that will be reversible. So coming to terms with some of the things that we couldn't change, right? So these characteristics of the stone themselves, they don't all match because they are all different stones. And so we just really tried to unify them as much as possible so you could appreciate Bacchus as a whole, but also they are still visually detectable because of the characteristics of each of the different stones themselves.
Great, thank you. We also got another question from Cindy Moorfield. Would the original arm have created a structural problem, assuming it was marble? Maybe that's why it was lost?
It's possible. Caroline, do you want me to answer that?
Sure.
I think what is more possible is that it was the Brummer Gallery. So the Brummer Gallery in New York was really well known for removing things that didn't look right. You know, things that didn't look accurate, if they were a little ugly. It was a time period when they were taking things apart. So if the arm looked like it didn't match and they could sell it better without it, I think that's what happened. If you look at the black and white photograph, it's more extended. It doesn't quite match the geometry of Bacchus. I will also tell you the head does not quite match the geometry of Bacchus. But the arm itself was standing out quite a bit. And if you look at the etching from the Palazzo Temps, there's a little dotted line across the arm connection. So it was obvious even then that those two pieces weren't original. And so I think what really had it taken off was that it didn't look right, not necessarily that it was structurally unstable.
I'll follow up on that with structural analysis and confirm that we would have been very concerned with the structural integrity of the right side with a right arm of marble going back on. You mentioned the shape being different. I actually had a follow-up question for Corey and possibly even some of the more artistic side of our scholars. But the pictures of Bacchus throughout the presentation today with his original right arm were much more proud to the right and extended forward. And when we scanned Wyatt, what were y'all's thoughts on bringing his arm over his head more, which was largely form following function, needing to keep his center of gravity inside his body?
On my side, I didn't see a problem with that because if you look at a variety of sculptures from like ancient sculptures or anything from the Renaissance, there is variation in that arm position. And because we also wanted to make sure that there was no structural issues, bringing it a little bit closer to the center still looks historically accurate, in my opinion.
Again, it goes back to we cannot do anything that will damage the artifact. And so if the arm had been extended in a manner that was out forward and caused a torque of the sculpture, that would have caused trouble for the knee. And the knee is also interesting because the knee is a join within the same stone. So there was damage at another point. So it may have fallen over, and these are joined damage rather than joined marble fragments in the knee. So that knee wasn't always damaged. And so when the arm was on originally, it might have been a much more structurally stable leg over it. And so we're working with what we have now.
And Corey, you actually got two more questions. One is, well, they're both from Noel. Can you explain the sulfur packing of the pin? And can you talk to the staining of the upper chest and lower leg that Jen mentioned?
Sure. So the staining is what I was mentioning before, the stuff that we weren't able to reverse. The sulfur is really an interesting question, and I don't have an answer because I have not been able to find the time period where sulfur was used in restoration. And so I might turn it to Jen and Mark and see if you guys have heard of sulfur packed pins before. Has anyone found any? Because I've not been able to find literature that has a sulfur.
I actually have seen that in 18th century and 19th century American architecture, like in the construction, joining stones of a well, molten sulfur would be poured in to surround and secure a lead pin or an iron pin, for example.
Perfect.
Interesting.
There's your answer.
If I may say something about the extended right arm, you know, one of the things that's so remarkable about this statue type from antiquity is that that right arm was, of course, I mean, the way this statue caught the eye was that it was carved ex unum lapide. It was carved from a single massive block, yeah? So that right arm in antiquity, the reason there's no join there in the ancient statue was because it was all one piece. And it was supported by, presumably, the tree-like support that held the hair up, yeah? So it's almost like the statue, the ancient statue had its own sort of like external armature, if you will.
Okay, we do have one last question, and I think this can close us out. This is from Tiffany Terrell. Is there anything that any of the presenters wanted to discuss or share about their part in the conservation process, but were unable within the time limit? And I think Lyle might have something.
I do, and if there's time, I'll share this. I have a slide showing the fluctuation in cost of the Bacchus. What do you want to do first?
I think it'd be interesting to see the slide.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to start sharing the screen. Okay. So this is what you see, and I think this is not. I mean, I think that the cost of Bacchus, the increase in value between 1945 and then, or decrease from over time and then increase, really makes some sense, but is interesting. For one, I think what I am struck by is the cost or the amount that Morgan paid in 1911 versus what the Morgan sold it for in 1945. And but I think that we have to take into account the major deflationary period during the Depression, and then of course the Second World War, but also, and I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to say anything more about that, but as a historian, I can tell you that Morgan paid and often overpaid for works of art, and he was notorious. I mean, he bought things en bloc, and especially from Canessa, and just spent wildly. So that is, I thought, is interesting to share. And if anyone has any comments, I'd love to hear them. But
I would just echo, I mean, I completely agree. There was no way that Morgan was getting deals. He's the richest man in the world.
you know, he actually was not very rich when he died. And there's a famous quotation from Rockefeller saying, and to think he wasn't even a rich man. He just spent wildly and beyond his means, and there wasn't very much money left when he died, and that is why the family had to sell art right after he died, in addition to donating it to the Met and the Wadsworth. But also I wanted to ask Corey, so I had always assumed that the arm had fallen off between the Morgan Library and the Brummer Gallery. You really think that they removed it?
I think they removed it. They were known to remove things and change them and alter them to make them prettier for sale. Okay. And so I think that's what happened. I don't think that the repairs in the knee and the structural damage that happened, I don't think that that happened in that time period. I think it had already happened because I also don't think there was enough time to put it back together between those two periods of time. I think the Brummers just were known to have removed things.
Yeah, we actually, that came up in a discussion with the curators at the Getty, who mentioned that to us. Yeah. As some of their works of art, when they did their provenance research, would find a picture, an earlier image with a fragment still attached that they didn't have when the statue came, when they bought it, sort of thing. So it seems to be a thing that the Brummers did, almost like a matter of course. If there's something that doesn't fit visually, aesthetically, they just removed it to ensure they could sell it.
Okay.
At a higher price.
Okay, and but they would leave the photograph they took when it came in their inventory records.
Yes, thank goodness. That's how we managed to find out when the arm went missing between 1945 and 1949.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Amazing, amazing project, Caroline.
Well, it's thanks to all of you. I could not have done this by myself.
I applaud you and all of the work that went into putting this back together. It's just fascinating. I loved hearing all the different technical presentations.
Well, thank you.
All
Do we have
right.
other questions, Maria?
No, no more questions. Polly Lyman was just seconding huge thanks again to her generous donors. But that is it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for coming. Can I ask all the panelists to stay for a short little while? This is the first time we're all together in 7 years, all of us present in the same room. That's quite remarkable. It's a virtual room, but still. So thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you everyone.